Welcome to the Theory of DFS podcast. I'm Jordan Cooper, the co-author of the Theory of Daily Fantasy Sports. It's a 15-hour audio DFS masterclass you could find at theoryofdfs.com. Join with me this week, the purveyor of Occupy Fantasy and the Emotional Bankroll podcast. It's Brian Jester. What exactly is an emotional bankroll?
The way I look at it is the range of emotions, right? Like we all have the money in our bankroll, but if your emotional bankroll runs out, then you start making bad decisions. So it was actually a term I heard on a gambling podcast, and it stuck with me. And I thought it was a great term.
So it's not the actual money. It's not like you have angry money or sad money.
No, it's just how much
the money has no feelings.
No, how much bankroll you got in your head of how much you can take.
Right, but that playing professionally. I mean, you would have to think that like the emotional bankroll matters when it comes to playing in a profitable way. There's no amount. There's like the emotional bankroll you have of being a lifetime loser it's just basically as much as you can afford. There's no right. There's no emotions behind it other than oh, I'm doing this for fun and maybe I get lucky one of these times. So that's more of an issue of if you want to call professional players, but where you're profitable from an expected value standpoint in the long run, but the name of DFS is not just playing profitably, it's actually realizing that EV.
Yeah, and you got to stick around long enough to realize it, right? We've had so many great players, and whether it's poker, DFS, sports betting, investing, whatever it is, right, that have the raw natural talent to be one of the best, but they don't last long enough because they don't handle that side of the equation as well.
So would you call it bankroll management? A lot of people call it like managing your emotional bankroll, but the way that you put it on your podcast, which I think is better, because I think there's a big difference between like intellectually understanding, like Kelly, right? Intellectually understanding that, like, yes, I'll play a percentage of my thing and what, like that, and the difference between I've just lost 6 weeks in a row and I'm down $28,000. Am I even good? Like I've always said, Brian, that that you're a good player. Like one of these proxies of if you're a good player is the opposite of how most bad players would act when they win. Where typically when you win, you're more likely to chalk it up to, okay, thank God I realized my EV. I was lucky to do that. And then when you lose, you're like, I must be doing something wrong. While bad players think in terms of, I must have been really skillful to win. And when I'm losing, it's because I'm unlucky. And like, if you're not spending like at least once a year on a downswing where you think maybe it's time to withdraw all my money from these accounts and go get like some type of job that probably may pay more possibly with the same skills, but just, you don't want to sit at a fucking desk all day and do shit that you don't like. Like if you're not thinking that at least once a year, then you're probably not playing well.
No, dude, you have to have that crisis at least once per year. And it's very little satisfaction, honestly, until you see like your bank account or whenever you do something with the money. But like you said, most of the time, I was fortunate my most recent win is actually in the middle of kind of an upswing where like pretty much every other win has been after a downswing and you're getting back into the green or closer to the green even. So it really is a sigh of relief most of the time, which it doesn't sound that exciting if you're not a pro player, right? Like people aspire to be a pro player or play professionally, but it's not all glitter for sure.
Right. Most of the time when I win a GPP, it like NBA $48,000 or MMA a couple of weeks ago like $40,000. It's not like you're happy, but it's more of like a happiness of like it's like you said, a sigh of relief. Like it's like, okay, I am good at this game, and over the course of the past 8 months, like that, those two things represented now I'm positive, right? It's not a matter of, I mean, you must see this all the time when dealing with people that you talk to, that you could say, okay, this year, you'll tell someone, this year I've had a $100,000 bink, a $50,000 bink, a $30,000 bink, and whatever, and they'll go, oh, you must be up like $250,000. It's like, no, I'm up to like 22,000. Right? Like, and they go, well, how are you only up 22,000 if you had all those big wins? It's like, well, you lose 90% of the time.
Right, dude. Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I had a friend text me after one of my screenshots last year. He's like, dude, I feel like you just crush it all the time. He's like, I need to quit my job and do what you're doing. I was like, no, dude, stay what you're doing. I promise. You don't see the in-betweens, right? People only see the screenshots on Twitter. Maybe we'll get a pro every now and then that'll post a rotor tracker chart where it's like psychotically all the way down and then a spike up. But most of the time, people are just seeing the positives of it. And I don't want to spin it as some super negative thing. I enjoy what I do and I love what I do. But the ups and downs certainly can wear on you.
Right. And the hardest part of DFS, whether you're a recreational player or a pro or whatever, is the sample sizes for these games are so small. 17-week, 18-week NFL season, right? Maybe you have 45 MMA slates in a year, or golf, or something like that, and you're there going, I don't know the difference between playing badly or getting unlucky. Like you
Right.
a lot of time we're playing well and getting unlucky. I mean, we have like proxies, top one, like for a daily sport, top 1% finishes, top 0.1% finishes. Like, Brian, how do you determine, like, especially, we'll get into, like, what I consider your specialty would be, like, MMA, esports, showdown, like, these kind of, like, small, not small field, but large field, small player pool,
Yes.
like, duplication-heavy type contest that I consider you'd be extremely good in. Like, how do you determine the difference between, especially in those contests, the difference between playing badly or being unlucky?
It's a super thin line, especially like for MMA recently. Like I track my uniques after every slate starts, right? That's the first thing I check before the first fight goes off, right? How many uniques did I have? What did the field do? And oftentimes I have a pretty nice sweet spot of I want to have this many uniques, and I'll see people have more uniques than me, and I'll think, did they play it better than me? Or are they just playing really bad uniques? Because it's a thin line, right? And especially like NBA Showdown, I think the line is so razor thin between having a good unique lineup and just a lineup that flat out can't win. Now in MMA, NFL Showdown, those bad uniques can win, but most of the time you just see some guy double stack or stack the main event in all 150 lineups, or a guy play a 5% fighter in 75% of their lineups, or fade a bunch of. Well, there's a lot of different ways you can have bad uniques. So first of all, check my uniques. Are they good? And then track those uniques over time, the number of uniques. Because for NFL Showdown, and I said this on a podcast this week earlier, where when I first started and when I won the million in Showdown, I was getting a ton of uniques when I first started. And I really didn't change my process that much. But 2 years later, my uniques have fallen off a cliff because the fields have gotten larger, the fields have gotten way sharper in NFL Showdown. And now I know either I have to change my approach to be more high variance, find some kind of other different edge, or just pack it up, and maybe the edge is now gone for NFL Showdown, and I move somewhere else. But then for the non-unique sports, really the biggest thing for me is, can I predict what the field is going to do accurately? Projected ownership, lineup construction. If I can do that, then I know at least where the edges lie. And if I go into a slate and I'm wrong about ownership and that trend continues, then I know, maybe I need to take a second look at this sport or step back from this sport. And that's really what it comes down to. There's all kinds of different metrics you can look at, but really what it comes down for me is, can I predict what the field is going to do, and can I predict what I'm going to do actually having plus EV?
Right. I mean, you've explained it the same way that I do. I mean, you used to do a showdown show with Colin Drew.
Yes.
That was good. And I considered you to be like, it was like yin and yang on that show, right? Sure. Like Colin was more, and Colin was great at showdown, but more in line with correlations, right? How could you correlate outcomes together better than the field? And your attitude was, I want to relish in the chaos where correlation doesn't matter as much. And that's highlighted by in the Super Bowl in 2019. You won $1 million. I won second half showdown, that same slate. I do the same thing in showdown. The high scoring games, it makes mathematical sense that correlation will exponentially matter more. The low scoring slates, dude, they're fucked up lineups that like you look at and go, this makes absolutely no sense. But correlation is so much weaker in a 13-3 game with only one touchdown.
Yes.
It's like, well, Edelman had like 12 for 150 or something. Michelle had the only touchdown. and it's like, well, it's like no quarterbacks and like a wide receiver, running back, defense, kicker, comp. Like it's some really weird thing that you're leaving 4,600 on the table. You're like, and you were, I mean, you cared more about that than the outcomes of the games, and that's why like I called you my spirit animal, because that's how I play NFL Showdown, and we'll go into that. There's a balance between the two methodologies that I think you lean very heavily on one side of, and because you lean so heavily on the high variance, like you're playing a lot of high variance lineups. You must have some. I mean, I'm pretty guaranteed you must have some MMA slates, some NFL Showdown slates where you're minus 96%.
For sure, and definitely NFL Showdown. And I would actually argue in MMA, I don't even think my approach is that exploitative. I think the sport is so young and the edge isn't realized yet, and my fingers are still crossed that it doesn't turn into NFL Showdown where all the pros flock and people actually figure out the right way. I actually think I'm playing pretty optimally in MMA, and people may look at my lineup that won 2 weeks ago, whatever, and the hate mail in my DMs would say otherwise. But first of all, I relish in the fact when people say that lineup was terrible, I can't believe you won. It's like, well, I did something right. First of all, I put such a dedicated strategy into each individual slate. Like if I have a lineup in there, there's a reason that lineup is in there. And I've built out, whether it's a story or some sort of ownership scenario where I think that's a good play and that's a good lineup. But I actually think in MMA, I'm playing it pretty straightforward because because I work with my brother really closely and he runs uniques and we talk about what other people are doing and whatnot. And before a slate will run, I'll tell him, hey, Moose, I don't know, man. I played it pretty conservatively today. I'd be surprised if I had top 3 uniques. And he's like, we'll see. And then we pull it out and I had top 3 uniques again. So I really think I've balanced in MMA that optimal versus exploitative. But in NFL Showdown, you're right, because the field has gotten so much sharper that it requires a higher variance approach. And yes, I will have slates where I might not get any money back.
Right. And in order to have the higher variance style that you have of the lineups that you build, the more important projecting ownership is, I mean,
Yes.
to me is the most important. Like that's how I view my play also. Like, yes, you could go by long-term top 0.1% lineups in non-dupe type of sports type of thing.
Yep.
But like in MMA or something like that, like it makes a decent enough difference to me between projecting a guy for being 24% owned versus 29% owned.
And I'm angry about that if I'm wrong by 5%.
Right.
The average person may think that's crazy, but that may mean 3 more dupes or 5 more dupes or 1 less dupe. And I didn't play that lineup because I thought it would be more dupe, right? The individual percent actually matters when there's only so many players in the field, only so many players you can pick from.
Right, and it's amplified. I in MMA particularly, maybe Showdown also in the mid range and not in the high and the low end.
Yes, yeah,
like
Romanov, right? Like
right.
55 to 65, who cares? Whatever. But or even like when I won Mike Jackson, if he's 5% or 11%, that doesn't matter too much. But when you get 19 to like 31%, that in between range, if you're on one end or the other, that makes a huge difference because that's where a lot of differentiation is done.
Right, but sometimes even if you're directionally accurate, sometimes you end up in a better situation than you are. I remember a couple of slates called the Terrence McKinney slate.
Oh God, yeah.
Where he was like why is he like 55% owned?
I was beside myself.
Right, and I overproject. I mean, to me, I think I overprojected his ownership to be like 42%. Yeah, right, I had him as the highest owned dog, and I was going to have very little of him. But when I saw 55, I'm like, wow, I almost want to get rid of like a couple of the lineups that I have him in now currently.
Yeah, just completely fade him, right? Yeah,
right. Exactly. I mean, probably I rarely do that.
Right, it's tough.
Right, it's tough. But to me, that I mean, you're preaching to the choir when you're talking to me like yeah, I upon upload at whatever lock time is in MMA or NFL Showdown or any of those types of contests. I mean, I know how well I played 1 minute after the slide. I mean, I could look and know, and we'll talk about the unique because I've altered my perception of how to play MMA a little bit, which is maybe
okay.
I'm trying to get in between the two lines, and we'll talk about that. That's the main thing I wanted to talk about. But people don't. A lot of average players don't understand. It's like I know how well I played upon upload before the first fight starts. Like, and they go like, well, how? Like, I put in my own. Basically, what I do is that I look at uniques. I look at under 5s. I look at under 10s. And I also, if I have the time, I'll do this afterwards, a slate. Look at which lineups were duped more than others that I have. Like, we'll get into, like, there's a difference between a lineup that I have that is duped 6 times that I expected to be duped 14 times, and a lineup that's duped 3 times that I expected to be unique, right?
Yeah, that's the most tilting, right?
That's right. Like, that's the most.
Like, and you're like, I don't even understand why this is duped 10 times, right? You're like, I definitely thought this would be unique. Why in the hell do 9 other people have this lineup? Yeah, that's the most tilting for sure.
Right. Well, we had this. That's like two weeks ago. That I was in Discords telling, I have one lineup that if you're playing large field GPP that you absolutely avoid, you do not play whatsoever. Was that Chimaev card?
3 high, 3 high.
The 3 high, because you can only pair it with the 3 lowest that are in a fight stack. And and it was duped 418 times in the contest. Right? Right? And I said this is the most negative EV lineup in the entire contest. And here's another concept that some average players fail to understand. Brian, would you agree with this statement? You would much rather lose on a slate where the lineup that won was duped 100 times than lose on a slate where there was a solo winner.
100 times out of 100, right? Because if it was unique, it's like, shit, I could have gotten that unique. Right? If it's duped 100 times, I'm never going to play that. Or even like last week, right? The main event fight stack. I'm never going to play that. And if it's duped, it's duped. It wins. And then you're not like rooting against other people, right? I want to see other people win when I'm not winning. But if it's a 100K winner and it's not me, I get furious because that could have been me. Where if it's a 21K split, let those people take it. I'll wait in the dark until it's time for my unique win.
Right. And even this past week, no one even had the optimal.
True. Yeah, true.
Right, which seemed odd. It always blows my mind on like 11 fight card is small enough that like I expect the nuts to be the winning lineup. 15 fight card, I could absolutely see the optimal not being played. But like sometimes we have I think we had a 9 fight card, I remember. Like maybe in the fall where the optimal was like a fight stack of like one of like the 4th fight on the slate. And no one played it. And it's like, even then I'm like, on a 9 fight card for no one to have the nuts seems always insane to me. But to me, that shows 2 things. One, that how much edge there is in MMA since there's so many people duping each other. Too much.
Yes.
And number 2, that it's much more easy to make uniques than you think it is.
It is. And it's funny you say that because so obviously we have a Discord and I chatted and I sweat the fights in there during Discord. And we have a user who's a top MMA player and he messaged me out of the blue one day. He runs a lot of simulations and I know there's a lot of discussion about simulations. I don't personally do any simulations, but there's one user does simulations, and this was during the winter break where we had a couple of weeks off from MMA, and he messaged me and he says, I was running some numbers, looking at things, and out of all the users at 150 max last year, you have the highest chance of winning when the winning lineup is not optimal. So he called it like a non-optimal win opportunity, some crazy metric, right? Mm-hmm. Basically saying when there's a lot of chaos on the card and no one finds the optimal, of all the 150 maxers, I'm the most likely to have the winning lineup, which I thought was super interesting. I think it kind of plays into how I play MMA and even some of these other sports.
Right. It's very similar to any other sport where it's like you win when the chalk fails less than your methodology and my methodology also. I mean, it's all play whoever you want, all the tropes and whatever is that like try to win the low scoring slates, right? Try don't win the slate when the heaviest, the most owned, favorite wins and scores 120, and the 2 highest owned dogs win and score 100 plus. Like there's only so many combos left of the 3 other slots that, like, there's no lineup with all 3 of them that's under 10 dupes.
Right. And
you're just like those. You're not playing for those slates, right? You're just simply playing for the slates that chaos happens, and not just. I mean, we could call it like what the Mike Jackson one. Romanov fight gets canceled, right? Mike Jackson wins a DQ, sure. Right? That's chaos.
Yeah.
Right? But just when the unexpected, it's not about being the most probable, it's about being the most profitable. And you have no problem to go along with the emotional bankroll aspect of like, I'm playing 150 chaos lineups, and if there's no chaos, I'm fine with losing 90% of my money. Because when I do win, you've had, what, 3 solo 100K wins in the past, what, year?
Yeah, just about a year. Last February was the first one. And I had a FanDuel one, too, for 50K. But yeah, so basically 3 separate 100K wins. And I think there's a couple of factors in there that are super important. First, you mentioned when the high-owned fighter goes off, and this is MMA, but it could be, like even this past week in PGA, John Rahm was 50%, right? Mm-hmm. And which is like the ultimate game theory approach on how you play that slate. And for me, I've played those guys before. It's like, well, what if I go way over the field? Or what if I even match the field? Or get close and I get different everywhere else? And on those slates, my uniques suffer most of the time. But 2, even when those guys play well, I still lose. And so my thought process is, if I'm going to lose anyways, why the hell would I keep playing the 50% fighter? Why not just play for the slates where because if they're going to win and I still lose, I have no benefit. But if they fail, now I have so much more benefit in my favor. And in order to play that approach, not only do you have to have the emotional bankroll, but you have the actual bankroll as well, because there's going to be so many slates where you go in between and don't win that you have, in order to be comfortable fading those spots or playing the most chaotic lineups, it has to be such a small portion of your bankroll that you're okay with doing that over and over and over and over again, knowing that over the long haul, it's going to hit. But like we said at the top of the show, you have to live long enough to realize that EV.
Right, but to me, that's the misconception that people have about being a nit. For example, I'm a very well-known nit,
yeah.
But it doesn't. But there's a difference between playing a small percentage of your bankroll and playing conservative lineups. Like the reason why I have no problem playing the game theory driven approach of stacking against the 40% owned SP2 on some baseball slate, right? Playing all those types of lineups is because, well, when I'm playing 0.5% of my bankroll, minus 90% ain't that big of a deal. You're playing 7%, 10% of your bankroll. Like, I don't have the emotional bankroll for that, right? Personally,
you can't have. I mean, it's just not feasible. There's some sports where I'll play 7%, and I've always been aggressive, whether it was poker or sports betting. I've always been aggressive on pushing edges. But it comes to a point, especially when in DFS, because DFS there's so many slates in so many days that you play 7%. That's 15 slates in your bust if you return 0% or whatever. So I've done a greater job, or at least I put a greater effort into the past 6 months or so, really mixing in more smaller field contests, more conservative return type contests, in addition to these large field chaotic 150 max types lineups, mostly because, well, financially it's easier, right? Like I've found bigger edges in small field contests that I've been playing and pushing more. So it allows me, like I said, to not hit a 100K at the end of a downswing. I was actually on an upswing and hit 100K. So now it's a great start to the year, but just emotionally as well, right? It really wears on you when you go 6-8 months without winning something big. And then when you do win, now you're barely green, right? It's just, there's so many, the bankroll management, emotional management is such a huge part of being a successful player.
In the smaller field contests, do you agree with me that the edge in those is that people tend to play too safely and that you're exploiting that? But there's also an extreme that there's a line there. Like, people take it the wrong way of like, well, in the smaller field, higher stake stuff, the chalk is chalkier, it tends to be chalkier. But like, to play too contrarian, you're actually even more negative EV, right? So like, there's a difference between like, I'm going to play all 6 of the biggest underdogs in the 555. Like, yeah, you're right. You are different. And all of those, maybe all those 6 underdogs are the most under-owned fighters, right? You go, they shouldn't be this low-owned because they're lower owned here than they would be in the large field. But like, the probability of that lineup, you don't, like, when that lineup's the nuts, like, you're winning the 555 by a clear 100 points, and you're not getting enough money for it. Like, you should be getting 100,000 for that lineup, and you're only getting 20,000 in the 555. So there's like a line there. But I find that in playing the 555, I'm much more likely to find one big leverage spot and then play, like, if you were to just go by default without any type of like analytical process of like a lot of times I'm playing the mid-priced favorite against the biggest, the most owned underdog on the slate, and going like, I don't need even 110 points out of this $8,800 fighter, but this guy could score 86 points, and because 40% of the lineups are dead, like, I could still win. I'm obviously not gonna win the large field with this lineup, but the 555, I could. I mean, like, I think that was I came in second in one for 10K with like a lineup that like literally only 3x'd in the large, like was like 486th place in the large field contest, came in second because it's like, well, the two biggest underdogs lost. And like, and I had the two fighters that were against those two, and it's just that so many lineups fell down that there you go, low scoring enough, and you win. I mean, do you what type of approach do you embrace for the smaller field stuff? Because I'm assuming you're more likely to hand build or like just meticulously select that type of lineup.
Definitely, and there's so many angles to talk about here. The first thing I would say is, yes, you do meticulously build for those contests. It's such a fine line between playing the chalk and playing too crazy. There's a certain amount just of uncertainty you need to inject into those types of lineups, because like you said, you don't need to be perfect. And that's also the reason why I don't mind playing the chalk in some of those contests. It depends, right? Like a Romanov last week. I
played Romanov in the 555.
Right, like that's an easy 90% chance of 90 points. Playing Rom in small field was still probably fine in PGA this past week because he has such a high floor, and he could fail a little bit and you still win, right? But it's those other spots that you need to look at. And my approach is, it's a kind of a hacky approach, and I put more time in, I think, into those types of lineups than most pros do. Like I said, I'm not simulating, and I'm not building. I guess the best way to say it is I'm putting more effort into each individual lineup in those cases than I am in large field. I'm letting the builder run. I'm maybe tweaking after I'm setting a bunch of rules, but small field, I'm taking tons of time on each individual line because I've had issues there in the past in my ROI shows where I'm just relying on my natural process and like, oh, this lineup looks good for this contest, let's throw it in there. Where I'm literally have separate process for each contest I'm building. So for MMA on Saturday, I'll wake up, whatever, and I'll build my 150. I'll set all those rules and I'll do that, set those aside. Now I'll enter another slate group and I'll specifically work on this hour building my 6 small field lineups for the 555. And it's a very different approach than my 150. And then if I have time, and most of the time I do, then I'll set aside, okay, what does the optimal cash lineup look like this week? And I'll start putting in rules in my builder and do things that way. But by separating it out individually, I've found way more success. And I know for a fact, just by talking to a lot of the pros on my podcast and listening to Discords on Twitter, that most pros don't do that. And I think that's where a big edge lies in small field.
I'm smiling because, like, you've described my exact you've described my exact process. It's just that I do all of that in reverse.
Oh, all right.
So determine like the cash lineup first. Like what is, because to me that's like the most dupe. Like, these are the what's the cash lineup that's going to be played more? What's the 2v2 on it? Like, you could determine like here's like the 3 lineups that I expect to see in double ups. Probably more of this than that. Right? Because you have the lineups that are going to have stacked the main event, right, that in cash, and some people don't stack the main event in cash. So which is the cash lineup that either could possibly play? So now I know what the combinations are. So now I could use that and go, take 4 lineups, 4 guys out of the 6. How many combinations of 2v2s are there? And what are those lineups? Take 3 out of the 6. What are the combinations? So I could see how many combinations of chalk lineups there are. So I know like what lineups to remove from my like 150 set type of thing.
Nice.
Right? And then from that point I do my small field stuff. I typically build 5 or 6 small field up, because I'll put one in the 200, 3 max, I'll put one in the 100, I'll put one in the 555. So I'm not playing 6 in the 555, but I'm playing like 6 lineups that have like a ceiling of $10,000 win type of thing. And for that, like, a lot of times I'm fading. If I'm like in those 6 lineups, like, nope, not going to play this fight. Like, this fight is over-owned, so just exit out.
You have to make the tough decisions there, right?
Right, no, right. You got right, exactly.
But now you actually have to figure out what some floor ceilings for these fights are. It makes it tougher for sure.
Right. Well, and then also how much leverage, like, it's like, okay, I'm going to take, because a lot of times in my 6 lineups in single entry, I may be playing like like both sides of a fight. It may be the type of thing where I know that I can't, that only one of these 6 lineups will survive. And if it does, and I'm right, I win first. And sometimes on other slates, I'm like these 6 lineups could all cash, right? Because the difference is like, let's say you build a lineup where it's like, it's a 15 fight card, and you're like, well, I'm going to play very similar guys. It's just that I'm going to, instead of the $9,200 fighter, I'm playing the $9,300 fighter. And instead of the $7,400 fighter, I'm playing the 75. Like, they're all like 2v2s, but like between all 6 lineups, no outcome is against one another. And then there are some slates where it's like, there's a fight that's under-owned that is a high chance of the winner putting up a lot of points. And I'm building 6 lineups, and 3 have one fighter and 3 have the other fighter. Yeah. So it's like only one of them can win. So essentially, I'm purposely saying that 3 out of 6 of my lineups are not going to have first place equity like upon the slate locking at that time. Do you put those into account, or do you try to make lineups that are more or less correlative when you're building out that 6 set?
So I can't go too deep here because I do think it's a pretty big edge, and this is across all sports in building a handful of lineups, because there is basically how you want to think about your lineups if you're doing this, whether it's your 6 lineups, whether it's you're making 150 lineups, you're making 20 max, or whatever it may be. You really have to think about your exposures from a player perspective and a dollar amount perspective in the lens of a portfolio of lineups, right? So if I'm making 150 in the big one, 6 small field, and a cash lineup, that's 156 lineups. I may have 20% of a guy in my 150, but I may have him in 40% of the small field, and I may have him in my cash lineup. And when you look at the dollar amount exposure, I have way higher exposure to that guy than my 157 would indicate. So someone may ask me, oh, how much do you have of this guy? It's like, oh, it's 20%. But in dollars, he's like 47% of my exposures. And I really think that there is an optimal way to play a set of 3 to 6 lineups. And I'll just say this, that the information is out there if you go study some of it. And when I say I don't do simulations, I don't like simulate a slate and say, oh, this guy is optimal X% of the time versus his ownership. Mm-hmm. But I have, during the off seasons, I've run these types of simulations where if I do this with my lineups, what does my outcome look like? When I was struggling and I wasn't getting as many uniques as I wanted to after the two year post Millie, I started running some simulations thinking, okay, if I play 3 captains in my 150, what does my expected ROI look like? If I play 6 captains, if I play 12 captains, if I leave X amount of salary versus Y amount, if I literally put a garbage trash 1% player in every single lineup, what does my ROI look like? If I put a defense in every lineup, what does that look like? If I fade to the defense in every lineup, what does that look like? And so by running those types of thought exercises, I was able to get a good amount of information to guide my lineup building process for all sports. And I've done that for all sports. And again, I put a lot more thought into that. And I think that's where my edge lies. Because again, I'm not going to outmath most of the top players, but I can outwork and outthink them in a different way. And by thinking about things differently than they are, I'm automatically being a little bit contrarian. So,
right. I mean, the fact that you're doing things that like you, I feel like we live together or something, right? Like you may be, and to be fair, I probably experiment way more than you do. I try to, and also I do a lot of things by proxy. Like you said, you're not running simulations. I don't run simulations either. I do a lot of my stuff in Excel. I'm not that great at Excel stuff, but I'm good enough. Especially in MMA where it's small, like the amount of lineups that you can make is so much smaller that doing those types of things is much more tenable than in baseball or something.
Yes.
Right? So like I try to find proxies. I try to be directionally accurate. So I run like for duplication, like I've explained it on videos for Roto Grinders that about 8 months ago, I changed my approach from an exposure driven, like how do I get to the most unique, most highest expected lineups through, piecing combinations together to incorporating it directly into the projection, right? To basically like include the owner. Basically, I want to include the ownership, the median or mean projection, as well as like the 90th percentile outcome, like inside of a thing where like the highest EV lineup should be the lineup that has and then you just hack the lineup builder where it's just like the projection is that number. So it's like if I have a number that's 7.36, that's technically the highest EV lineup because it has the most under-owned player compared to the projection probability, the betting lines, and least likely to be duplicated type of thing.
Gotcha.
Like it's all built in together.
Like Romanov, for example, right? His median projection would be like 91 points in projections, but because he's 55% owned, that number's lower for you the way you build or in those types of projections because of the ownership and the
but not because but once you weigh in the betting line, like the correlations between the round one and inside the distance lines are so high, the R squared for 100 plus point scores. Like I weigh them very heavily over fight data. So like Romanov at minus 650 inside the distance and minus 210 round one, he was under-owned. Like he was literally under-owned. Like in my if I were to run 150, like I ran 150, so to experiment, I always run 150 straight. Just 150. Like if I don't do anything and I just go directly just by this leverage score that I have, Romanov appeared in 100% of lineups. So that shows to me that he's under-owned relative to his ceiling. But I have to give you credit also because I had to incorporate some type of fight data that isn't mean based into my account. Because what would end up happening, like back in July, it was weird. Obviously, I created the sheet, and like literally the next day, I won $116,000.
Oh, it really justifies the process there,
right? It's kind of justified right there. It was a three-way chop on a pay-per-view card, so but I'll take that.
Yes.
The problem is that I was my sheet was rating out guys like Rosenstruck, like the low volume knockout artists. Because they would have it would be plus 130 inside the distance. But it's like the chances of them getting 130 points are very low because they'll get 100 by a first round knockout. And if they don't knock them out in the first round, they ain't getting 100 points.
Nope.
Right? But they're inside the distance line and the round one lines are very high. So I would get that having rated higher than Merab Dvalishvili, who inside the distance plus 275. But it's like his dude. In a 3-round decision, he scores 140. Right, exactly. So I had to find a proxy for that. And mean projections are just too close to... They're all normally distributive. Like around the industry, like you go and it's like...
so bad.
Right, and these fighters don't have normal distributions. So you know what I use as the proxy? For that? Instead of scraping fight data and doing it myself...
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't know. What do you got?
I use the OF index.
I believe I've heard of that. Which does incorporate fight data. So
right. Well, that's the reason why I do, because I know that you incorporate fight data, and that essentially what the OF index is that in a win, how high does this fighter score in relation to other fighters on the slate, and the disparity between like Romanov was like 169, and the lowest fighter was like 53, and if you just went by ceiling projections, which are normally distributive typically. You'd get something like, okay, Romanov's ceiling is 134, but this other guy is like 110. And it's like, that isn't true.
Doesn't help you.
Right. Because it's just as proportional as the mean or median projection. So I need something that was much more like bimodal in a way. And I'm not doing all this fight data stuff myself. And I'm not going to I'm not watching tape. I'm not seeing, Grant Dawson, he wrestles. So obviously his upside is higher. Mazzani, we all know DraftKings scoring favors high volume ground and pound wrestlers more than stand-up strikers. So it's like, but instead of me doing it myself, I always try and can I find a directionally accurate enough proxy? And I just I aggregate ownership projections across the industry anyway, so I'm using that from your site as well as part of my multiple amount. And we'll talk about ownership projections also, but just having the OFI in my, now I have to experiment how much I should be weighting it. That's the problem.
Not that much. It's not that predictive. Don't worry about it. Just a little bit into your projection. That's fine. You don't need it anymore. And in fact, I would say you don't even need it anymore. Blender, just don't You don't need
Just
that.
don't. Oh, you're trying to get me to not use it because that's
it's not that important. No, it's not,
it's not important, right? I'm trying to pimp your wares.
No, I appreciate that. And again, we put a lot of effort into that, and specifically into the MMA model for sure. And yeah, that was the goal. That was really the goal in creating that specific model. It's the goal for us in all of our models that we created. And I say "our" because my brother does a lot of the grunt work on the data side. I was a computer science major in college. I did not finish my major. I failed out of my computer science major. I have enough understanding to look at code and know what's going on. Beyond that, I can't fix anything, right? I can't write code myself. So I have a decent understanding. But our goal, honestly, when we started Occupy, and when I first started playing DFS, was I know every projection in the industry is at some point driven by Vegas projections in some way, whether it's money line, total, knockout percentage, whatever it may be. How can I find inputs that lead to some type of predictive scoring that does not include Vegas? Because I know everybody else is doing that. If I can get somewhat close, I'm going to have a naturally contrarian projection system, and now add in my style of play. I'm playing so much differently than everyone else most of the time that I don't have to play, because the way I'm doing it, I feel like I'm playing optimally based on the information that I have. Most of the time, I'm really not trying to quote unquote get contrarian. I'm just playing with the information that I have and the style that I have, and I don't have to think too hard about what I'm doing on each slate.
Right. And me, I use ownership. Like it pats myself on the back. I get the ownership from every site that offers it, and the R.
Yeah, you have to.
Right. Now I aggregate that, but I also do my own ownership, and my own. And then this is the reason why I don't. I will never sell my own ownership, is because it has no it has no like core. Like I can't, like it's not something that can. It's not going to equal, like, dude, it's not even going to equal 600. Like,
It's all by feel. You're doing it by feel.
Right. It's all by looking at ownership around the industry and going, yeah, whoever's projecting Christian Jocko to be 22% owned is just wrong.
Yes.
It's just.
I say that all the time. It's like, can I just take the money I'm going to play on this slate and bet against that site that their ownership projection is wrong? Because especially in MMA, right? Other sports, and the most common sports, right? It's going to be there. But like, I'll look and I'll say there's zero chance that is happening. There's no way that ownership is going to be
right. But then you adjust, and then I go through and I'll put my own ownership in and go, yeah. I think this guy will be this. I think this guy will be this. The industry is under projecting this guy because I'm listening to podcasts. Sure. Just going through. I'm looking for the human factor of like, dude, like Arlovsky is not going to be 16% owned. Like he's not. He's going to be he's going to be 10 at most, right? And I think maybe even 8. But then once you start putting him at 8, you have to go, well, where does the ownership go? And then you start bumping up and you go, Grant Dawson, 28%. It's like, get out of here. More like 35%, right?
Yes.
Right. But I'm saying, but if you know how people react to stuff, you're putting it in. But the thing is that people are using those ownership numbers.
Yeah.
Right? So so in aggregate, I mean, there are most slates, not many, but most slates, the aggregate has a higher R squared than all of the individual sources.
Sure.
Because sometimes we'll get a slate where, I mean, like one site will project a guy for 32% owned, and another site will have it at 14. And like that, one of them is going to be way off. I mean,
yeah,
something like
that.
It's
not going to be the average of those.
It's right, and it's probably not even going to be the average of those, right?
Right.
But the R squared, because I've done it since back in July, my R squared is the highest.
Nice.
Right?
That's
so
huge.
I can't. It's not dramatically enough different than the aggregate, because sometimes I'm wrong a little bit more because I'm doing it on like not segmenting out. Well, on high price fighters, I'm a little less and like that. So I just basically weigh my own personal field projections as the highest weight in the aggregate of all of them. So I get a little bit closer to mine, but not all the way to mine with the aggregate. And then I compare, and then once, obviously, the slate locks, I put in the actual ownership. And then once I put in the actual ownership, my sheet will tell me what the scores based on my thing should have been. And then I could look, and I'd even do this after the slate. I go, if I would have known that these were the actual scores, how would my lineups have been different?
That's smart.
And then a lot of times I would put it in, and my lineups being different actually produce worse results. I mean, like, obviously it depends on the results of the slate, but there are certain slates where, like, I remember Felipe Lin's, like, I had projected like 22% ownership, and he ended up coming in at 30. Yeah. And I had him in a ton of lineups, but it's like, even though he
30,
won,
I would have played him a ton if I knew he was 30.
No, right. I wouldn't have played him as much as I did had I known he was 30. But right. It turns out he scored 91 points, and like, it was better that I played a lot more of him. But that's not. But you understand the difference, and good players of the. I look at that as a mistake, not the yeah, sure, yes, 44% Lin's is a lot if he's 30% owned, and he should be 28% owned as an efficient metric. But that's what at 1 minute past slate lock, I could look and go, if I win with the Lin's lineup, I mean, when I won $116,000, I won with Luque, and I had Luque in like 6% of my lineups. I had him as one of the most over-owned fighters on that slate, and he was in the winning lineup, but the lineup itself had the proper, only because it was a slate where a lot of people lost. But Luque was one of the chalkier pieces that actually won and was in the optimal. I just had him with like 4 contrarian pieces. So like you're simulating more of your portfolio, and I'm thinking more simulation on like individual lineups of like, based on the leverage of this lineup, would this have made my 150? And like on that Felipe Lin's thing, I went back and I go, well, out of these, I think I had like 62 or about 62 Lin's lineups. And like 18 of them, had I had it at 30% ownership, shouldn't have made my 150 set. And some of those lineups were profitable, and some of those were profitable. But
yeah, but it's not about the results.
Right,
it's
right. Right.
Figure out things beforehand. And
right, but you understand, I'm trying to look at the lineup level and not necessarily the portfolio level. To me, portfolio is more about like just risk tolerance more than anything, that I'm not going to just lock people in or whatever. So like it's just weird for me that we both use a very similar process and come up with different lineups. But you can.
That's the beauty of it. Like, we both have an idea of what we want to do. We execute it a little bit differently. And yeah, I look at lineup level data is extremely important too, and I look at that as well. And I'll say there's nothing more tilting than you're sweating your lineups. You see a lineup that already has 3 fighters that fought. All 3 are low owned. All 3 have gone off. You're like, all right, now I'm rolling. I just need this chalk piece to actually win for a change. You're actually rooting for the chalk, and then they fail. You're like, well, this is why I hate chalk so much.
Right.
Because the one time I actually need it doesn't go off.
Now, the question I have for you, as far as we talk about uniques, okay? I used to be in the camp of uniques are God, right? I want uniques. But with the realization that not all uniques are good, right?
Yes.
Playing the 6 lowest, the biggest underdogs on an MMA slate and leaving 6,000 on the table, probably a negative EV lineup, even if it is unique, right? Same for showdown, right? I'm going to play all the $200 guys, right? I mean, like, come on. Like, I'm going to play all the bench guys in an NBA showdown.
Right.
Maybe in USFL. If you'd play USFL showdown, maybe you could win that way. Because no one knows who's playing. But I've tried, by using betting lines as a proxy. Like I said, I'm not simulating anything. I've theorized, at least from using that as a proxy, which is not precise, that we said before, the barbell of duplication, if I want to call it that, like, it's a bigger mistake, like, it's a less mistake. If you play a lineup that is duplicated 15 times, like, there's not as much of a difference between it being duplicated 15 or being duplicated 16 times.
Right.
As the difference of playing a lineup that is duped 3 times instead of 2 times.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, for instance, if you think this lineup is unique and it ends up being duped 4 times, right? Well, that is a bigger mistake than playing a lineup that is going to be duplicated maybe 10 or 12 times, and it ends up being duplicated 13 times. And it's like the difference between that one extra, because you're now splitting, right? That 13th place is only an extra like $800, right? Yeah. But up towards the top, like, you don't want that. So I've gone through what I've attempted to do, and obviously this past slate, I knew upon upload that I was negative EV because fucking that fight got canceled, and
Absolutely.
I didn't have time to do it. I did everything all day. I spent 4 hours. Everything was beautiful. I did everything and everything like that, and then the Candelario Tyra fight, and now I have to change everything.
It's always after you finish your lineups, every single time. Every single time.
But the thing is that I've theorized that there are lineups that are duplicated, typically not more than 10 times, but lineups that are duplicated somewhere in the 5 to 10 range that are have a higher expected value than ones that are either way too unique, obviously the ones that even you don't play, or ones that are like duplicated twice, but their chances of winning are still very low, that I'm more inclined now to aim for under 10s and under 5s over pure uniques. And I believe in the past couple of slates, I've still gone too far. I'm building 2 duplicated lineups, but I think there's a line somewhere where if you're just like, let's say in 150 lineups, I mean, I look at your stuff. You'll have 150 lineups. You'll have 127 uniques, right? And you'll have 148 under 5s, right? Or something like that. And I'll be like, okay, like this is for you. That's beautiful, right?
Yeah.
That type of thing. Then I'll look at mine and it'll be like, I have 150 lineups. I have 116 under 5s and like 26 uniques, right? Like something like that. And I'll look at my under 10s and have most of my lineups under 10s.
Right.
And I feel that on some of those slates that my portfolio set could be higher expected value than yours and have lower variance because I'm mixing in some lineups that do chop 8 ways. And I am, yay, great. I have $18,000 or something like that. Well, you almost never get into those spots. Either you're winning first solo or something, or, with maybe one other person. And I'm doing that a little less often, but I'm getting more money back when I lose. That like over the course, like I've done this over the course of like 10,000 simulations, that you're still plus EV, right? But the distribution of your graph is like fucking ridiculous. And mine is much more smoother. And at the end of the day, in some simulation methodologies, you come out ahead, and some I come out ahead.
Right.
But it's weird to say that, like, I'm not in aiming for not caring as much about uniques. That maybe that under 5 dupes is I don't want to say a better goal because we're talking about lineups and portfolios or whatever. Have you looked into this, or are you still like you're good at making unique? So instead of having to adjust your process to be like, well, how many under 5 should I be allowing? How many under 10 should I be allowing? That you've shown an ROI that as long as you're willing to handle the swings, it's like, why fix what ain't broken?
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm glad you brought that up because over the past year or so, I've really backed myself into that. Because if you listen, when I won the Millie, I went on Davis Maddox's podcast, talked with Colin Drew, and I was adamant about uniques, right? That was my approach back then. And things changed. And as smart people, we should take new information and change how we think about things, right? So 3 years later, I've thought about that a lot more, and I've backed myself into it. And it really is slate specific. There are some slates I'll walk in, I'll build lineups. I'm like, well, this is easy. I can get 150 uniques without even being bad, right? This is fine. But this past slate, like you just said, was a perfect example of I made my 150 and I'm tweaking for ownership and whatnot. And I'll look and I'll be like, this lineup, I have a duplication calculator for MMA. And it's like, this will probably be duped around 8 times, but it's such a good lineup, right? And I don't have a very mathematical approach about what a good lineup is, right? But I'm like, this is a good lineup. I don't need to change this to be a unique lineup because it's so much worse and unlikely to win, where I'm okay with it. So this past slate, where like you said, I normally have 127 and 150. This slate was 67 uniques, but it was 150 under 10. And when I saw that, I was actually happy because that was the approach I wanted to take on this specific slate, because 55% fighter, only 11 fights. And I thought there was only a certain way you can play it. So I think the key takeaway here is you have to be flexible in your approach, understand what has worked and what can work. And part of this past 6-month transformation for me is if I don't have to have such a high risk approach, a high variance approach, don't take it. Look for more low variance ways that the field isn't doing. I think that's kind of what you just described, but I back myself into it, and I do think it's something that has helped me be even more profitable over the last year or so.
Right, because me and Neil talked about it, I think on last week's show or one of the past 2 shows, about slate context.
Yeah.
Like, I like the slates. And I'm assuming you're the same. You're the same way. You would have this past slate would have been a little bit better if Romanov wasn't on the card.
It'd be fantastic. I don't want a 55% fighter on any card, and God forbid a pay-per-view like the Volkanovski card. I was like, I have no chance of winning this card. I already know going in. Of course, it's going to be the highest entry fee slate of the year so far because the 555 is 10 max and it's $25 in the 150. And I feel like I'm drawing that going in just because I know there's so many 50% fighters. The way this slate's probably going to play out, it's probably not going to be great for me. Whereas I love the 13 fight, 12 fight Apex cards with a bunch of unknown fighters where no one gets above 40%. Now I can easily play optimally, have 150 uniques, and know I have a really good chance of winning. It's no surprise that my 3 wins, and 4 wins if you include my FanDuel win, were on non-pay-per-view cards because those are the cards I know for a fact I know exactly how to play. I don't have to get crazy. Whereas on pay-per-view, I kind of have to manufacture it a little bit, so I'm not really looking for it from a DFS playing perspective. I'm not looking forward to the UFC event this weekend.
You're the opposite of me. I do the best on the pay-per-view cards.
Oh yeah, because your 3-way chop was pay-per-view, right?
Right. Well, also I like the more fights the better.
True.
And also on pay-per-view cards, typically the fights are closer. Like, to me, the context of a slate, the biggest variable to me on slate context is the difference between the win odds and the salaries. So like on the Chimaev card, for instance, we had him, Pedro, like we had like guys minus 800 at the top, that it's like the likely, like the optimal lineup is more likely to spend most of the salary because of that. Now on this past slate, if you took Romanov off, Philly's minus 225 and he's the most expensive fighter? Like, those are the slates where some 48-3 lineup could win because all the fights are close. So that's why on like pay-per-view cards, I enjoy those cards because it gives me more options. We have more close fights. So when it's like, oh yeah, this guy's clear. Like we'll have Michael Chandler coming up, right, next week against Tony Ferguson. Is he really worth 9,600? Like, I don't know, right? I mean,
Probably not.
But the thing is that the more you add these 9K fighters to the slate, the more likely people are like, well, why am I gonna leave 900 on the table and play the $8,500 fighter that is less likely to win? Right. Why don't I just pay up there? So like, to me, it's so much easier to get unique while still not losing much expected value by, like, look at this past slate. No, if all you had to do was play Levy over Romanov and leave 600 on the table, solo on 11, like, and there's no reason, like, Levy, if you looked individually between Nathan Levy and Romanov, and you go, how often does Levy actually outscore Romanov? It's like
not 0%.
Not 0%, but you've heard on so many shows the past week that, like, dude, Romanov's going to destroy him, but destroying him in the first round, dude, if he takes him down, submits him a minute and 12 into the first round, that's like 97 points. It's you could visually, like, you don't even have to do math. You could just visualize how the most expensive fighter on the slate by far he scored 112 and he wasn't optimal. I mean, like he ended up in the winning line because he was so high owned. So like I like looking at the slate context of that, of how likely is the optimal lineup using all of its salary, using less of its salary? What's the salary range? I like when the optimal salary range is somewhere between 49 and 49.5. Like, where it's not 48 or anything like that. You build a lot of those types of lineups.
I know, right? But those get tricky. Those get tricky fast. And again, that's slate dependent as well, right? Because 2 slates ago, when the Romanov fight happened, I had a lot of sub 49K lineups in there. Just because as I was building, I couldn't get my exposures right unless I lowered the salary. And I started thinking about, well, how can these types of lineups win? But the other reason, going back to the pay-per-view really quickly, the other reason I don't like pay-per-view cards as much, generally there are more established fighters on those cards. Very rarely do you have a card of 5 fighters making their debut, 6 fighters in their second fight. Whereas on these Apex cards, we get that a lot. And the range of outcomes are so much wider. And the projections are much more based on their Vegas odds, and the Vegas odds are much more proficient because they have so much data on these fighters. I mean, you get two fighters, UFC debut. I mean, literally anything can happen, right? We have these guys fighting from different parts of the world. We don't actually know what their approach is going to be in the fight. The Vegas odds, sure, one guy might be minus 200, but there could be tons of variance in those odds. And that's where, first of all, that's where the OF index comes in so much and the charting that I do. But I love those fights because the ownership condenses in places where I know they probably shouldn't. And we'll have underdogs that are, by Vegas odds, look terrible, but I know that their range of outcome, if they win, is so much higher than some of the other underdogs around them. Whereas we get into the pay-per-view cards, we get established veterans as underdogs, as favorites. And for me, it's just hard to creatively envision how some of these lineups fail. So that's just my personal approach. And again, it comes back to range of outcomes and what I'd like to see happen when the expected doesn't happen.
Right. And we are similar, but the opposite way. So from what I could tell, like those types of exploitations are more underdog focused, right? The line is off, right? So it's like people are overrating one guy over the other. I like the pay-per-view cards because the larger the slate is, I get ownership on the favorites that no one's like I won a whole bunch of money up with Miranda Maverick on a month or two ago, or whatever.
Those are my favorites. Yeah, I love those.
Right, because people underplay the female fighters, and you look at I had tons of Jotko yesterday or Saturday. Like I like the things where everyone is. If they're going to play a guy in the 9K range, they're going to play one of these two guys, and all these other people are going to be underowned. So it's like, I don't care about the to me, it's not about the number of underdogs that win. It's this past slate, can any of the 9K fighters outscore Romanov? I want those lineups, right?
They always can, yeah.
Right. So you're relying on the fact that no one knows anything. Maybe this guy shouldn't even be a minus 180 favorite. Yeah. And the underdog should actually be the $8,800 guy, which is more of a price salary exploitation of like you're relying on the fact that these salaries, because no one knows anything, are off. And me, I'm just relying on the fact that people there's no reason why this $9,100 fighter is 32% owned and this $9,000 fighter is 11% owned, just for the difference of plus 160 versus plus 280 on the inside the distance.
If they're going to win the fight 67% of the time, 70% of the time, right? If you just go by whatever the win probability is based on the money line, right? You're going to tell me that this fighter, if he's 12% owned or she is 12% owned, that 12% of the time that they win, or whatever that math is going to be, right? Like they're only going to be a great play that small sliver of the time that they win. No, it's just not true. And for me, like Casey O'Neill was a great example where it was like the ultimate. Like I couldn't have asked for a better spot. And of course, I won the 100K on that slate because I'm glad it was justified, because you get low owned fighter, you get female fighter, low KO odds, super low owned. But because I charted and saw how type of fight she has, and she has no data, that if she wins, she's going to absolutely smash because of her grappling style. And I get that in. And so I'm like, okay, 45% Casey O'Neill exposure when she's 18%. It's like, that's the fights you want to happen. I won another one with Castaneda, and he was an 8% as a favorite. It's like you talk to people, and it's like, well, you look at the fight matchup. He doesn't have that much upside, might lose. But to me, the thing is, you literally cannot fade a sub 20% favorite in MMA just because of the volatility of it's a freaking fist fight. Like things happen. If he wins, it's kind of an exponential. Once the fight starts to turn, and because projections can't capture that. Right? You get a knockdown, all of a sudden, your chance of getting a slate-breaking score just skyrockets. So all it takes is one little thing to happen in a fight, and the guy goes from an 8% optimal to 50% optimal, right? It's crazy to me.
And then sometimes you get the opposite way of like, oh, if this guy's going to get 8 takedowns or whatever like that, and then it's two wrestlers that stare at each other for 3 rounds.
Yes.
Right? Because neither of them wants to go to the ground, and you're sitting there, and people are like, oh, you got to get exposure to this fight because there's going to be tons of exchanges on the ground or whatever, and it's like, nope. They stand up and or you never understand, like, you don't know what their game plan is. Sometimes some wrestler goes in, you go, if he wins, it's going to be on the ground, and he decides to like, nope, I think I'm good on the feet, and wins a striking based decision.
We don't know what these fighters are going to go in to do, right? We know what they have done in the past, but these are humans that we're dealing with. Like, we wouldn't have played Chimaev if we'd have known his coach's game plan ahead of time. Don't wrestle, don't brawl. It's like, well, we find that out. If Chimaev's going to sit back and just jab this whole time, we're not playing him, right? But Chimaev threw out the window, started wrestling and brawling, and now he scores 100 points, right? So even if we know the information, things change in the fight. So for me, that it all comes back to there are so many things that we don't know going into a fight that's what makes, for me, one of the most profitable sports. But I mean, you can say that about any sport, right? You don't know the context of what's happening in an individual or on a team level.
Do you consider the worst? I consider that this is weird to say. I think MMA is one of the best sweats.
Without question. Well, right? It's probably by far the best, yeah. It's
so linear, and anything can happen in a matter of like that.
It's the greatest. Yeah.
But it also includes the two worst sweats in MMA.
The main event fade?
Yes. That's number one. Let's go to the second worst one. Okay? The second worst one is obviously if you have 150, you probably have every fight anyway. But if you're playing if you're a 1 to 3 lineup type of player, when there's a slate breaker in the first fight.
Yeah.
Right?
Which seems to happen more often than not, by the way. But yes.
Well, because typically they put the most inexperienced fighters in that first fight, and you never high variance. But yeah, I mean, there are tons of people. I'm in a Discord where, first fight up, 118 for a $7,200 fighter, and it's like, I got 0 out of 20, I'm dead. Like, well, you're dead to win first. Yes. But you could still win. And also in the smaller field stuff, you may be live to win first anyway.
You don't have to get that, and that's the thing about small field too, right? Like the 9K fighters, if they all score within 20 points, it really doesn't matter, right? It's always 1 or 2 spots that matter, right? So for me, it's like I can play 6 Romanov, or I can play 3 Romanov and 3 Feely or whatever. It's like as long as they both score between 90 and 120, I have a chance at first in that contest. So it really doesn't matter. It's really those other spots lower that matter more for small field.
Yeah, but you're right. The number, what you said, the main event fade, right? Because typically I'm assuming with you, you're like me. The main event tends to be over-owned, so I tend to have less of it. And the one that I won $116,000 is the Gone Lewis one.
Oh, that's a good one to fade at least.
Well, no shit. That's why I had very little. I had very little of both fighters, and I'm like sitting there going, okay, the lineup down that has Gone needs like 119 points. So it's like at the volume of this fight, I'm not considering it that much. Yeah, I guess Gone could score 119 if he wrestles a ton. Derek Lewis needs like 86. And with any Derek Lewis fight, it could end in one punch. So you're sitting there in the first, like, I just want nothing to happen. It's just like, please.
Just stare at each other.
Just stare at each other. Right. And my wife is there, and I'm just like, I'm just standing there. I win $116,000 if nothing happens here. And I'm just like, they're just sitting about, like, that's the worst sweat, because you're rooting for the opposite of anything to happen.
It's so bad, dude.
Right. So you're sitting there, and then once it's like survive the first round, and then like Lewis like only threw like 2 strikes.
That's great.
And then I'm like, dude, now you know what I'm rooting for? Like
quick KO, just get it out of the way.
Right, get it out of the way. Right. The third round, once the second round ended and the third round started, I'm like, dude, I hope someone wins right now. Like now I'm actually rooting for like it to, because like I don't think Lewis can't score 86 and Gone can't score 119 unless something fucked up happens in the next 3 rounds. So just fucking knock him out now.
Gone just starts grappling for no reason, racks takedowns, knockouts. It's like, no, just get it over with. So my 3 100K wins have all been main event fades. I've had so many sweats where I've actually needed the main event and it hasn't panned out. But the 3 main event sweats were Blades Lewis, and the first round I'm like, just don't do anything. This is great. I go nuts, nearly hit my head on the ceiling when Lewis knocks him out in the second round because he only gets 80 points or whatever. Mm-hmm. Next one is Caitlin Vieira, Miesha Tate, right? Mm-hmm. They do nothing literally for 5 rounds. I'm chilling back. They could have scored 90 points on a loss, but I was like, this pace is great. I don't need to worry about it. And the most recent one was the one I was most concerned about was Andrade and Lemos, where the winner only needed 99 or more. And I was like, this should be high paced. And I went nuts when
standing arm triangle, right?
Only standing arm triangle in history in UFC. Is like, well, I'll take it. Believe me.
Right. I thought you were gonna say Walker Santos.
Oh, that was another good one too, right?
Yeah, that was maybe the worst main event I've seen since watching MMA in 2 years.
Dude, the winner had like 47 in like a 5-round
in a 5-round fight, right?
Yeah, but it's the thing, right? So like, I've needed Poirier in the main event before. I've needed I needed Oliveira before, right? I've needed so many of these different guys in main events. you just got to put yourself in those spots, right? Whether you got to fade it or whether you got to root for it. I'd obviously rather root for it most of the time, but you can only get yourself in those spots so many times. And I think I've hit probably 3 out of 10 on what I've needed the main event to happen to win 50K plus, or 4 out of 10, I guess. But you know, you can only do so much. It's out of your control at that point. But
I actually had a sweat. This was almost 2 years ago. There was an Usman main event.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who he was fighting. Covington, maybe? I don't know.
He's only fought a couple of guys, right? So
right. But it was a fight where Usman was heavy chalk, main event favorite, and like it was the millie. They were running a millie. This was like when COVID was like July of COVID season.
They need to bring that back, by the way, please.
Right.
More MMA millies.
And it was a three-way chop. I'm up there like $360,000 or something. And people in Discords are like main event starting. It's like, you could do it. I'm like, dude, like Usman, like if Usman scores like 88 points, I'm dead. And it's like,
which is like 95 percentile.
Right. That's why I said like, I have such a small chance of this holding it. It's like, don't root for me. Like I'm telling people, like I am not considering this to be like, this is a formality now.
Right.
And this is the old score. This is before they changed the scoring. And it was a fight where the first two rounds, there was tons of cage clenching.
Yeah.
And they didn't get points for strikes.
Right.
And you didn't get control points back then. So unless it was a significant strike, they were literally racking up no points.
Right.
So by the third round, the third round started and Usman only had like 17 points.
You're like, oh shit,
maybe this is actually going to happen. Of course, then he has like 4 takedowns the next round. He ends up scoring like 107 or something and it whatever. But like, that was the only time where it's like, dude, I know what I need in the main event. And I'm literally here going like, I'm literally not even rooting for it. I'm just like, this ain't happening. No. And then it turns out that you get a little glimmer of hope. It's like, maybe it can happen. And then it doesn't. Right.
So that just goes to show, right? Like, even Usman 88 points, you would bet that every single time. But it's a fight. And if he'd have finished that early round 3, like, you would have won. And you would have thought that's never going to happen. Right? Like, I think it was a couple weeks ago in the 5-5-5 when Volkanovski was fighting. I needed Volkanovski under, 100 points. And I was like, there's really no chance. And from the outset, he had no chance of scoring less than 100 points. But, you know, you may think that you might not have a chance, but the sweat is there. And that's what makes it one of the best sweats in the world, because it is so sequential. And by the time each fight rolls around, you know exactly what you need to have a chance at a top prize.
Right. And the basically the end of your slate is when you don't have any live lineups left.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah, exactly. It's like, I might watch the fight because I've done so much work and I want to see how it pans out, but I have 0 live lineups left, and I don't even care about what my return is. Right.
The enjoyment of your slate lasts as long as you have live lineups. And this past slate was one of the I think 5 fights in, I literally had 0 live lineups, and it's like, dude, I typically last more than 5 fights with 150 lineups, not having something. Right. That like has a hope, right? It's like, okay, I got these 3 guys. If this guy outscores that guy, then Shannon Young won't be optimal, and then I'm fine. I don't need Shannon Young.
That might be a record, dude, for 150. Only 5 fights in, being Dunzo.
Yes. Typically on like a 13-fight card, it's like by fight 10.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and then it's the rare case, like probably maybe 20% of the time, maybe 10% of you have a live lineup heading into the main event. In something, it may be in a single entry or something like that. But I mean, you could say the same for Showdown, right? But the NFL Showdown is even. I mean, NFL Showdown. There's no such thing as it could be the 2-minute warning, right, dude? Sometimes, I mean, I've seen people, and it wasn't me, sweating fucking kneel downs.
Yeah, it happens. Colin has sweated kneel downs before on the plus side and the bad side. He won one of Colin's first wins was on a kneel down. If the quarterback had kneeled 2 yards instead of 1 yard, he would have lost $100K. But then in the Super Bowl, when Mahomes kneeled down in their win, he lost $50K on the kneel down. So I mean, it's the most extreme way of playing a unique sport. But I mean, NFL Showdown, there's nothing like it for sure.
Right. In MMA, you don't necessarily get that, right?
No,
because there's those small events with that many lineups and everything like that. It's like, dude, before the main event, you could look at literally all. I mean, you just even scroll on your phone and go, let me see where I see, fighter remaining 1, What do they have? Okay. If that,
and you don't have to worry about stat changes either. That's the great thing. No matter how bad we think the stat tracking is, right? Once it's in. So
you have to worry about judging though.
I mean, so many people complain about that, and to me, that just adds to the variance, which is great for me, right? Sure, I was pissed when Collier lost a decision, but I'm also not a fighting expert, right? I know there are sites out there and touts out there and great analysts out there that actually break down the fight, and they literally know what they're talking about as far as fighting styles and like fighting tactics. I don't know anything about that. I never trained in MMA, but I have a reasonable idea of who should win a fight, who should win a fight. So I get mad when my guys don't win, but I've been on the plus side of those types of exchanges as well. So I mean, I can't really complain about it.
Right, you're rooting for a robbery, right? You're sitting there going, I got the dog. He scored 74 through 3.
Yeah,
but he got rocked in like the first and second round. And he came back in the third, and it's like, but especially if you're playing 150 in large field, and you have a bit of everyone, like you're almost rooting for the worst case scenario, like typically for if you have a bunch of a fight, is for the favorite to win a low scoring decision.
Yes.
Like sure. I just rather him have no points and the other guy have 120. Yeah. You don't want, we have fights where the winner scores 72 and the loser has 60.
Yes.
And it's like, no, I would have rather those 30 points go to the 60-point scorer because a 90-point score at 7,300 do way more better than me than the favorite, right?
Well, like the Dean Barry Mike Jackson fight, nuts kicked, eye poked, and I'm like, the commentators were talking about it. I'm like, oh yes, DQ, please DQ. Then at least my Mike Jackson gets 97, whereas neither fighter gets more than 30 points. Please call us a disqualification. And again, you can, if you're a true UFC MMA fan, you may say, oh, that shouldn't be a disqualification. I don't really give a shit, right? Whatever the outcome is going to happen. Whatever can give me the most points. So believe me, I changed my profile picture to the Mike Jackson eye poke just in solidarity with the decision. So I'll take it.
Okay. So Occupy Fantasy, people can go there, occupyfantasy.com. You have models for every sport, right?
Yep. For most sports. Yeah. For most of the sports we do. Yep.
Right. And I watch your, you put together like a 20-minute video, typically for UFC on your YouTube channel.
Yes, we do. Every Friday. We try to. Jake is he writes our daily plug at occupyfantasy.com. He owns MMADFS.com, and we're partnered with him. He does a great work, and he jumps on the videos with me every Friday. So
with Colin kind of getting out of the industry, you're going to be doing a showdown show, NFL coming up with Justin Freeman or someone, or I mean, because to me for these style of these format contests, I think. Like, while a lot of people run simulations, a lot of people talk about correlation, I think you're one of the few that I hear on these shows that preach more of the, let's just act as if, relish in the chaos. Yeah. What type of lineups more, instead of trying to predict outcomes, you're not on there going, I think this guy's going to do this. Well, you're just like, dude, I just want to build uniques and hopefully something stupid happens. And then 700 people reply to my screenshot of how dumb I am for winning this contest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I'm not in the business of predicting fights for MMA. I'm not in the business of predicting outcomes. I know, basically, just let me figure out what people are going to do, and let me think about ways that doesn't happen. And again, I put a lot of thought into it, so it's not just like if this doesn't happen, here's a bunch of crazy shit, right? Like I put actual thought into all my lineups, and yeah, I think showdown. We're not sure what we're going to do yet. Davis Maddock filled in once Colin left last year. But yeah, people really enjoy those shows, so I'll definitely try to figure something out to get going for the NFL season. I enjoy doing those. It's just NFL is a hectic season from a content producing standpoint.
No USFL showdown?
I play the prizes honestly aren't big enough for the stress it would cause me to build lineups. So I'm playing the classic slates and been doing well in those. But believe me, if they had 50K USFL showdowns, you'd find me in the chaos streets.
Yeah, but I mean USFL this season seems like perfect for a chaos person because, dude, you feel free to play sub 1% on guys because they're not actually inactive.
I know. This is the craziest shit I've ever seen in my life. Like, there's just rules, and they just like sometimes the rules get fouled, sometimes they don't. I see people complain on Twitter. Again, I understand, but we're all in the same boat, guys. Like that shit may happen. From a longevity standpoint and a prize pool standpoint, it's not great that this is how the USFL is operating. But from a pure DFS player perspective, in the here and now, I'm okay with what's happening.
Okay. At Brian Jester FF on Twitter. Last question. It could have been my first question.
Let's hear it.
You don't follow me. Do you hate me?
Do I really not follow you?
Yeah.
I'm gonna rectify that right now.
Because you want to know the truth. This is the honest truth. I would have had you on the show a year ago, but you used to not have DMs open for people.
And I didn't even know that, honestly, until like a couple months ago. It was when I started the Emotional Bankroll podcast. I was like, oh, I can't DM you. I was like, really? I never noticed that. So my apologies to you. We are now following each other, and let's continue to live this relationship.
So sometimes I'm the type of person that's like it seems like he's following everyone that I follow, right? It's kind of like
I see your shit on my timeline all the time. It's like, well, clearly I follow him, right?
Right. It's like I go to DM. I think I went to DM you like literally like a year ago, and it's like can't send messages to follow. And it's like, do I want to do a public at what? It's like maybe the dude just doesn't like me or something. So
it
like,
takes a lot of pride to do a public ad. I'm not a big fan.
Right. So I'm like, I'll find someone else or something. So like once I was like, let me try Brian. Okay, maybe I've always wanted him on, and then it's like, oh, his DMs are open. Oh, okay. Do you want? And you're like, yeah, sure, I'll come on. It's like,
dude, my apologies. I had no idea. So I'm glad we're following.
Doesn't matter. You could unfollow me later after the show. Do it for public PR purposes.
We'll see the quality of your tweets over the next week or so, and that'll determine it.
Okay. Brian is at occupyfantasy.com. The Emotional Bankroll Podcast. Subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, you get the Theory of Daily Fantasy Sports. It's a 15-hour audio DFS masterclass you can pick up at theoryofdfs.com.